Tom promised, that during the talk on morality, today we're going to talk about sin. Can everyone hear me in the back? Yes? Okay. So I'm always nervous when I give a presentation, and I always tell Tom, we always have a discussion, I think I'm going to be nervous, especially when I'm giving a presentation on sin. And he just looks at me and says, "Why would you be nervous? You're good at it."
The presentation, of course.
So today I am going to talk about sin and how it can separate us from God. So it's no surprise that sin is a dividing factor when it comes to our relationship with God and with others. And so let's just kind of do a reflection really quick. Who here tonight is a sinner? I'm surprised Judy raised her hand because I really didn't think that was possible. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk about sin as part of our journey through salvation history. We're going to talk about how it all began, the concept of original sin, and separation from God. How do we become separated from God because of our sins? And then we're also going to talk about the types of sin, so venial sin and mortal sin, and then we're going to wrap it up with a little redemption. So we are called to be saints. We're not called to be sinners. We're called to live an ordered life. We're called to goodness. And over the past couple of years, I would say that I have heard more than one priest talk about how we are called to be saints. And a couple of classes ago, I think Judy talked about saints and the communion of saints and Mary. And it's a very important topic. It's very foundational in the Catholic faith. So the Catechism of the Catholic Church teaches us that sin is an offense against reason, truth, and right conscience. It is actually a failure to love God, and it's a failure to love our neighbor. And it's really a failure to love ourselves, because we really need to love ourselves for us to be able to love God and to also love other people. It starts with us. It's also a perverse attachment to what would otherwise be a good. So what I'm talking about here is, we'll just bring up the elephant in the room. So let's talk about sex. It's good, right?
Yeah, baby.
Yeah, exactly. It's good. But when does it become this distorted or a perverse attachment? Maybe anyone take a guess?
I mean, STDs are the downside.
I'm sorry?
STDs are the downside.
STDs? Okay, so STDs, what does that mean? Usually that means that maybe you're being promiscuous. You're having sex with a lot of different people. Pornography might be another one. And so there's a lot of things where you can take something that's basically good, foundationally good, and then to have this perverse attachment to it can really change the nature of it. So when we sin, it is really wounding to human nature and in our solidarity. It's an offense against God is what it actually is. It distorts us and it wounds us, and that's what sin can do. So yes, sin is a big deal, and again, it's kind of the elephant in the room. Sometimes it's, maybe we're afraid to talk about it. We want to deny it. We want to say, well, yeah, maybe I do sin, but it's not really that bad. So like I said, sometimes it's the elephant in the room, and sometimes it's very subtle. Sometimes it's very hard to find. Sometimes it's very hard to be able to identify it in us when we're doing it. And maybe it's kind of a little white sin, like white lies versus big lies. But what happens when you lie a lot? Even if they're little lies, what happens?
They can get bigger lies.
They can get bigger. They can be compounded, right? And unfortunately, it's not like money, right? When money compounds, that's a great thing. But when sins compound, that's not such a great thing. Another thing that how I like to demonstrate it actually is like this. If you take, well, that one's not going to work. If you take something like this, and then you start to fill it, so if these were like little eyes, and you start to fill it, what happens to the surface?
Start to grow.
Yeah, it looks like a petri dish, doesn't it? But so what happens to the surface? Yeah, it starts to grow. It starts to displace everything else, and so it just grows and grows until finally it's completely full. So to get a good understanding of sin, we really need to look at salvation history. Genesis tells us that humans are created by God in the image and after the likeness of God. And so do we have a volunteer to read Genesis chapter 1, verses 26?
I can do it.
Okay. And you'll have to speak kind of loud.
Okay, so then God said, "Let us make human beings in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and tame animals, all the wild animals, and all the creatures that crawl on the earth."
Yeah, so God created us in the image and likeness of God. He created us in the image and likeness of Himself. So in the beginning, everything was great in the garden, right? It was paradise. It's like living in Hawaii, somewhere like that. It was great. And Adam and Eve were really close to God, and they were close to each other. But then what happened?
They ate from the tree.
They ate from the tree, right? Everything was great. Everything was beautiful. And then sin happened. They disobeyed God. And then in doing so, it really distorted the garden, more or less, right? It wasn't such a perfect place to be anymore. So let's talk more about how God created us. Genesis says God created us in the image and likeness of God. He created us as unique and having a special dignity and value as persons. And it's God's gift of love that continually sustains us and allows us to reciprocate this love. We are created as a unified whole, having a material body and a spiritual soul. And we are made to be in communion with God, and we're made to be in communion with others. And we're called to flourish. We're not called to languish. We're not called to be disordered. We're called to a life of order. So after Adam and Eve's decision to disobey God, things changed in the garden. Like the garden, the garden became disordered, it became full of trials, it became full of pain, and it became full of suffering. And their sin effectively separated them from God. This pattern actually then persisted throughout future generations, and we are experiencing it today. Separation from God is a matter of free will, and what I mean by this is it's not God, because God is immutable. God doesn't change. When we feel separated or feel like we are kind of in the middle of a desert, it is because we've moved away from God. It's not the other way around. Has anyone felt like they've been in a desert or felt just very isolated? Felt like maybe God has abandoned you? Yeah, I have too. What is your tendency? What is it that you want to do?
Get out of that desert.
You want to get out of the desert, right? What do other people want to do? Do you want to get out of the desert, or do you want to curl up and ball up and stay in the desert?
feel a lack of motivation in the moment. It's hard to make decisions when you're like secluded, like you were saying.
Yeah. Despair. We're going to talk about despair here in a minute. Yeah, so the tendency sometimes, it's either to run, so flight, right? Or sometimes maybe it's just to isolate and freeze. So I put this in here, and I'm trying to just figure out a way to word it. I added it at the last minute, but I kind of wanted to get at sometimes when we feel like we're in a desert, sometimes when we feel like God has abandoned us, sometimes this is the result of just really bad stuff that's happened in our life. Maybe it's the result of what somebody has done to us. Maybe it's the result of what we've done to ourselves, decisions that we've made in our life. And this can sometimes cause things like depression and anxiety. Trauma, big deal, right? That's really a pretty normal response to something really bad that's happened in our life. And we have physiological responses to that trauma. We have psychological responses to that trauma, and we have spiritual responses to that trauma. And I think the other thing that I would add to that is because of our life experiences, we also develop core beliefs over a lifetime. So these core beliefs often shape what we believe about ourselves, the lies that we tell ourselves. I don't know if you've heard that before. What we believe about others and what we believe about the world. So original sin was the result of freedom or our free will put to the test. So man, though, failed the test because he chose himself over God. As a result, we are all implicated in the sin. So remember, I don't know if you can just remember, I don't know if they still have gym class or not for some of you younger people. Do they have gym class in schools? Maybe, okay, maybe little kids, okay. So maybe just think back to maybe when you were in gym class, or maybe you were at lunch and somebody messed up. Somebody messed up, so now everybody has to run laps, or everybody has to be quiet, right? Nobody can talk at lunch. Yeah, this has happened, right? And so that's kind of what I mean by we're all implicated by the sin. One person does it, and then the rest of us pay for it. So, in other words, we're kind of guilty by association. Who has Romans chapter 5, verse 12? And this is Paul's warning to us.
I got it.
Okay.
Humanity sinned through Adam. Therefore, just as though one person's sin entered the world, and through sin, death, and thus death came to all in as much as all sin.
Yeah. So we're all implicated. So it's through this, what we call this inclination to sin, or it's called concupiscence, that causes us to remain disordered. The Catechism of the Catholic Church teaches us that human appetites or desires which remain disordered due to the temporal consequences of original sin, which remain even after baptism and which produce an inclination to sin. So even though we have this inclination to sin, we are essentially good. So goodness is foundational, and that's really important to remember, because it's sin that comes along and distorts this goodness. It wounds us. It disfigures us. It distorts us. It causes disorder out of order. So I'm going to give you an example. So for instance, maybe you desire companionship or connection or intimacy. But to do so by maybe committing adultery or sex outside of marriage is taking something that's basically good. We all want companionship. We all want intimacy. I just said in an earlier slide that we're called to communion with others and with God. We want to feel intimate with God. And there's actually some research out there that looks at attachment styles and compares the attachment style that we have with each other or with people, maybe with our parents, and it compares that to our inclination or our attachment style to God. So it's something that's very normal. We want to feel these things. But the problem is when we commit sin to achieve these things, these basically good things. So now we're going to do a little exercise. And so does everyone have a piece of paper and a pen? It doesn't have to be like, we're not going to hang them up or anything. So if you're worried about that, don't worry about that.
Anybody need pens?
So this is just a way to demonstrate how sin can distort things that are basically good. And so with your dominant hand, if you can, just on a piece of paper, write, I am a saint.
This pen has no ink.
Oh, you need a pen.
The first one in the account is one.
Try that one. That one, okay. Is everyone done? Do you believe it?
Getting there.
Getting there, right? We're working toward it, right? That's what we can hope for.
I have faith.
Great. Yeah, you have faith. Yeah. Okay, so with your other hand now, your non-dominant hand, if you're both right and left-handed, then just like, oh well, I guess this isn't going to work as well for you. But with your less dominant hand, write the same thing.
Looks about the same. I'm learning like Billy Young.
How did that feel?
Horrible. It felt such a weird horrible.
It felt horrible. What else? Let's get some descriptions going here. So how else did it feel?
Difficult.
Awkward.
I was very
Okay.
patient. I was very patient.
Very what?
I was very patient.
You were very patient. So what does that mean?
He had it more than me.
He had it more than you. So you were very patient. Yeah. Yes. Unnatural. It felt unnatural, right? And so the same thing with sin. It really creates this feeling, these feelings that don't feel natural, that doesn't feel right in your gut, right? You're thinking, wow, maybe this is wrong, right? It feels awkward. It feels unnatural. Sometimes you have a lot of patience, though. And you can have a lot of patience with sin, too, right? And you can do it over and over and over again. So that's just kind of a little example of what, just kind of get the message across about how sin can really distort something that is basically good. So, but choosing between good and evil, just making the choice. I'm just going to choose between good and evil. Today, I'm going to get up in the morning and I'm going to choose everything good. It's not that simple. It's not like choosing between vanilla and chocolate ice cream, right? It's a little more complicated than that. It's more like a swirl, I would say, right? A chocolate and vanilla swirl. So, again, the Catechism of the Catholic Church teaches us that the root of sin is in the heart of man, in his free will, according to the teaching of the Lord. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, fornication, theft, false witness, and slander. And these are the things that defile a man. But in the heart also resides charity. It also, in our heart, resides love. And it is that love that sin can sometimes wound. It can stain. And you're going to learn about the sacrament of confession. So just kind of keep that in mind when we talk about how sin can stain, can wound us. Keep that in mind when I think Father Irwin's going to talk about the sacrament of confession. Is that right, Judy?
Next week.
Okay. All right. So sinning sometimes causes us to think that God has washed his hands of us. He's abandoned us. How could we possibly be loved by God? He can never forgive me of all the horrible things that I've done. And I'm just going to guess, you don't have to raise your hand, but I'm just going to guess there's a lot of people in the room here tonight that have that same feeling. That maybe think, wow, these horrible decisions that I've made in my life, these horrible things that I've done, how can God, or anyone else for that matter, possibly love me? How can I love me? So who has John chapter 8, verses 3 through 12?
I've got it.
Okay.
Then the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery and made her stand in the middle. They said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" They said this is to test him, so that they could have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and began to write on the ground with his finger. But when they continued asking him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let the one among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he bent down and wrote on the ground. And in response, they went away one by one, beginning with the elders. So he was left alone with the woman before him. Then Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She replied, "No one, sir." Then Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on do not sin anymore."
Yeah. So Jesus does not condemn us when we sin. He forgives us, and he does this ahead of time by dying on the cross. But there is one condition. He really wants us to repent of that sin, to acknowledge it, and then not sin again. But what happens if you do sin again? How many here have repeated the same sin more than once? Yeah. We're human, right? That's part of being human. So let's think of it this way. So if you have a baby, and the baby poops in its pants, or in its diaper, and then you change the diaper, and the baby's happy now, the baby's great, has a clean diaper, and then the baby poops again. Do you throw away the baby?
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. You throw away the diaper, right? And this is just going to keep happening, right? But you're going to love that baby, and you're going to throw away the diaper. You're going to change its pants, and you're going to give the baby a clean start. But you're not going to throw the baby away, and Jesus isn't going to throw us away either. Okay, so does anyone here work for the state or for the government, or used to work for the government? Okay, so you'll get this when I say it. Okay, so where's the guidance document? Where's the guidance document to prevent yourself from sinning? Well, we can start with the 10 Commandments. That's a good place to start. And we're going to walk through all of these. I know everyone's kind of grown up with the 10 Commandments on the most part, but we're not going to spend a ton of time on this, because we have a lot to go here. So I'm going to breeze through these fairly quickly. So think of it as the 10 Commandments. Think of them as the minimum rules of behavior for loving God and neighbor. And this will make sense here in just a minute. So the 3 first commandments, what do the 3 first commandments have in common?
Loving God.
Loving God, yeah. They deal with how we are to love God. And so if you can just kind of keep that in mind, the first 3, how do we love God? What do you suppose the remaining 7 commandments help us to do? Yeah, exactly. It teaches us to love our neighbors, right? And so honor your father and mother. You shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, and you shall not covet your neighbor's goods. So on the flip side, when we fail to adhere to the guidance document, what usually happens in government if you fail to follow the regulations? Prison. Hopefully not. But yes, it could happen. Right? Maybe you get a citation. Maybe you get some kind of order or some kind of a violation of some kind, right?
Reprimand.
A reprimand, exactly. A warning, right? There's lots of different things. So when we fail to adhere to that, when we fail to follow the 10 Commandments, then sin happens, obviously. And so there's 2 types of sin. There's mortal and venial sin. And we're going to go through these different types of sin in a little more detail. But these are just some general categories or just some general things that you might be familiar with. Can anyone add some more to this? Like, let's go with mortal sin. Can you think of any more mortal sins?
I think like attacking somebody doesn't necessarily have to be murder, but just violating them.
Okay, so violating them. Yeah, these are just very obvious ones, right? So violating somebody in some way. Yes.
I was gonna say fraud, but I'm not sure if that's already on there.
Fraud?
Is that already on there?
So fraud would probably fit under mortal sin. I guess it depends on what you're talking about in terms of fraud.
There's lots of different kinds of fraud. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Just very active.
I mean, it's advisable not to do it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Not to engage in fraudulent acts. I think it probably falls under one of the commandments or in
False witness or something?
yeah, I think so. Could be, yeah.
Or stealing from thy neighbor.
Huh?
I mean, technically stealing from thy neighbor, you could be fraudulently getting that and taking from them.
Yeah. So fraud has a lot of different ways that it can be expressed. But yes. Can you think of any little venial sins that, in addition to these, that are obvious or that you might have experience with?
Minor lies seems obvious for all of us.
Minor lies. Yeah.
Gossip.
Gossip, yeah. And how easy is it to get wrapped up in gossip?
We're all chickens out of my job. we all click.
Yes, yeah.
Taking something from somebody, maybe they don't notice it right away. I mean, does that make sense? Like, eventually they're going to find it that it's gone, but you're just kind of taking it or stealing it from them.
Yeah. Right. Or like sins of omission, right? Keeping something. What if I keep something from Tom? Because I don't want to like hurt him. I don't want him to have a miserable night. But I'm going to keep it from him because I don't want to ruin his night.
Is this like my mom, where you said
No, I'm not saying Yeah. So not telling people. And what about? I mean, this just kind of came to mind, but like if you steal something from work, and you might not view it as stealing, but maybe taking a pen, or maybe taking some paper because you need some paper to put in the printer at home. Maybe taking a roll of toilet paper because you're out of toilet paper and you don't want to go by the store, so you're just going to take it.
Take the ketchup and the mayonnaise.
Take the ketchup and the mayonnaise, right? Okay. So we're going to listen to this short little video about sin, and this might help to clarify some of what we've just talked about.
How do we really know when something is right or wrong?
How do I really know what I'm doing is a sin?
That's a good question. What is sin, and are all sins the same?
We've been talking about freedom not as license, not as the ability to do whatever we want, but rather as the gift to live in God's goodness, to live according to God's law and in the light of His love for us. Yet one of the consequences of the freedom that God gives us is our ability to reject Him, to reject His moral law, to live according to our own choices and our own devices. We see that already in the book of Genesis, at the beginning of the Bible, when Adam and Eve reject God, throw Him off, and want to be their own gods. We label that rejection, we define that refusal as sin. The church fathers say that sin is the misuse of the powers and gifts that God has given us. That's a great definition because it points to the fact that even those who sin think they're choosing good and are using gifts that God has given them, but simply not for the right purpose. So sin is really a refusal to live in relationship with God and with others, and rather to choose for egoism, choose for self, to enclose ourselves in our own little world with ourselves at the center rather than God at the center. There's a gradation of sin, isn't there? Not all sins are equal. In the Catholic Church, we define that difference as the difference between mortal and venial sins. Mortal, which means deadly, is a sin that is so grave that it severs our relationship with God. And therefore, to get back into right relationship with God, we need to go to confession. We need to confess that sin and experience the healing power of His forgiveness and grace. Some examples would be adultery or murder. As Catholics, we still say that missing Sunday Mass consistently will gradually diminish and even kill that life of grace within us. Venial sins are sins of less importance. They're still sinful, but they don't sever that relationship with God. They're telling a white lie or cheating on a test, perhaps, are examples of venial sins. The whole point of the Christian life is to move from egoism and self into an ever fuller relationship with God and with others. Sin are those moments of choice when we step back from that grand project of salvation and grace. The good news of our faith is that even when we sin, we can go to Jesus Christ through his church and start over again. Like the prodigal son, we can return to the Father's house. And that is good news for us.
It's the year of faith, and we're
So we're going to just briefly go over the two different types of sin, and I thought that video really captured and really helps to clarify the difference between mortal and venial sin. Well, mortal sin is a grave infraction. It destroys divine life in the soul of the sinner, and it basically is a turning away from God. For sin to be mortal, 3 conditions must be present. So the sin must be a grave matter. You must commit the sin having full knowledge of the evil. And you must fully consent to the act. So this is, I don't know if this was brought up in morality last week, but this gets kind of sticky sometimes. It wasn't? Okay. Well, we'll save it till the end. Maybe someone will have some questions on it. Just on culpability, the whole concept of culpability. So we've often heard of the 7 deadly sins. Not to be mistaken for the 7 deadly sin, which is a wine, but these are the 7 deadly sins. And with each of the 7 deadly sins, there's also an antidote. So there's also a virtue that we can foster to help us avoid the 7 deadly sins. So can you kind of guess what those might be? I know they're there, but let's take lust, for instance. What comes to mind very instantly when you think of lust? What is the opposite of that? What is the antidote?
Chastity.
Yeah, I mean, you cheated. It's up there, right?
Being pure.
What?
Being pure.
Being pure, yeah, being pure.
Pure.
Come on, guys.
But
It's right there.
chastity
The answer's right there.
Chastity works.
Yeah, so let's see. Let's take another one. What about greed? What is the antidote to greed? Being generous, yeah. What's the difference between greed and envy? Okay, so let's talk about venial sin then. This venial sin does not destroy the divine life of the soul. It is wounding though, and it diminishes the soul, but it doesn't completely destroy it. It is a failure to observe moderation, so this would be lesser matters, right? And we talked about. Can you think of maybe something that you do in your personal life that lacks moderation? Maybe it doesn't fall into a deadly sin, but still it lacks moderation. Can anyone share? Yes.
Every time you get on Facebook, there's always a female object. Always.
Okay. Yeah, they just pop up like the pop-up ads, right? Yeah. It's kind of in your face all the time, right? Yeah. What do you do with that?
Try to delete.
Okay. Okay.
You delete one and 5 others come on.
Yeah, so there's something in the act of contrition that talks about avoiding the near occasion of sin. It's Tom's favorite line because he works so hard at it. Also, venial sin is acting without full knowledge or consent. So that would be like grave matters would be acting with full knowledge and consent. Venial sins doesn't have that condition on it. So there is good. I mean, we've talked about sin all night, but there is good news because while we are created, we're created in the image and likeness of God. We have fallen, so sin happened. It distorted us. It wounded us. But we are also redeemed. So God, even though we struggle with sin and we suffer its consequences, God can make all things work for the good. And through Jesus Christ, God gives us new dignity to human nature and redeems mankind through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This redemption calls us back to God and each other and to the interior healing and growth. It is an opportunity to conform our will to God's will. And this is what happened with sin in the first place, is that we moved away from God's will and we were acting on our own will. So what would have happened had Mary chose her will over God's will? Yeah, it changes salvation history in general, right? So this is another short clip. This is Catholic Answers. This is Jimmy Akin. Have most of you heard of Jimmy Akin?
What? No, Peter. What's been doing?
This is not Jimmy Akin. This is not Jimmy Akin.
Oh, yeah.
This is like his producer or something.
Patrick in Jacksonville, Illinois, on 95.9. You're up next. Hey, Patrick.
Yes, as a Protestant, I grew up Protestant, and so I've been on a journey lately to understanding Catholic Church, and so my question is, do Catholics believe that Christ's blood covers any sin that a human can commit, or are there certain sins that his blood doesn't wash away?
Jesus' sacrifice was of infinite value because of his infinite dignity as the Son of God, and therefore there is no limit to what his blood can cover. So anybody who repents and turns to him and seeks his forgiveness can receive it.
Okay.
Okay. No class of sin that's excluded from that. Right, other than, if you're not repenting and turning to him and seeking forgiveness, but he still paid even for that, because if you then turn around and repent of your unrepentance, his blood covered your unrepentance. You just have to seek his forgiveness.
And if you don't turn around, then that would be the unforgivable sin, would it not?
According to the standard understanding. Patrick, how's that?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. That actually helps out a lot. It actually clarifies a lot of misunderstanding that I've heard throughout the Protestant viewpoint, and I'm really glad I called in, and that was the answer I was looking for, so thank you.
No problem.
So basically what he's saying is it's the dirty diaper thing, right? Is the baby's going to continually mess its diaper. That's what babies do. And that's what we do. While we might try to avoid sin, that is part of our human nature, is that we're probably going to sin. That's what was set up for us early on in the garden, right? So we still have all of that suffering. We have that sin. We have that woundedness. But God forgives us. And God continually calls us to him. And one way that we can do that, which we'll talk about next week, is through reconciliation. So we're going to wrap it up. So original sin kind of sucks, right? It was necessary in validating our free will. And even though we are fallen, we are also redeemed. So there's the good news right there. We were created. We are fallen, but we are also redeemed. So remember also that you are created in the image of God. So all persons we're sinners, we're saints, and even those who, and so are sinners, saints, and even those who have harmed us in some way. We're all created in God's image. And the interesting thing is, God's not going to take that free will away from us. He's going to allow us. He'll allow us to sin. He allows that free will. He's not going to take it away from us. But it is our responsibility to try and avoid sin. And if we do sin, then we do something about it. We try not to sin over and over and over again. It might happen, but that's okay because God's still going to love us. So that is pretty much it. I'll see if I have one more slide. Yeah, I have questions. But I did want to cover the topic of despair really quick because that was brought up. So despair is actually a sin against God. The Catechism teaches us that. Sometimes people talk about despair in light of depression, but those are kind of different things. So when we talk about depression, maybe even as a disorder, like a mental health disorder, that's a little bit different than falling into despair. Despair is losing all hope. And God wants us to have hope. And when we lose hope, and when we fall into complete despair, then we are sinning against God. Does that make sense? So if you do fall into despair, it's definitely something to talk to your priest about, to maybe go to reconciliation, to maybe even see a counselor about it or a spiritual director, because it can be pretty serious and it can really start to isolate you. It can cause you to be in that desert and freeze and stay and wrap yourself up in a little ball instead of getting out of that desert, instead of moving toward God. It causes us to move away from God. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Okay, so I know that like unforgiveness is like a big one too. Would that be like mortal or like demon of a country? Like if you're having like a hard time forgiving someone.
Yeah, okay, so the question is unforgiveness. Does that fit under venial sin or is that a mortal sin? So, does anyone have any suggestion about that?
Wouldn't that fit under like wrath or anger? If unforgiveness is, or is it having revenge or having some sort of anger towards somebody, I think that would fit under wrath. So that's one of the 7 deadly sins, the fruits. But
I feel like unforgiveness kind of hurts yourself more than it hurts anyone else, and I almost feel like really kind of depends on how your behavior, how you act towards it. But I would kind of consider it maybe as a venial one.
Yeah. Okay, so we have wrath, that it might fall under the deadly sin of anger or wrath, and then we also have that it might be venial. So I think the answer is it kind of depends on what's happening with that unforgiveness and how you're responding to that unforgiveness. But remember that to forgive someone doesn't mean that you forget. You know, if somebody does you wrong or does you harm in some way, it doesn't mean that you have to forget it. You know? Because you're not going to forget it. It's something that happened to you. And so forgiveness comes from a different place than that. I think you hear the saying, forgive and forget. That's not the case. Yes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to recognize Jesus calls us to forgive sin. When someone wrongs us, we're called to forgive it. But that's not to validate that it was all right. But it does require this idea of to love being to will the good of the other. So you're willing their good and that they would recognize the wrong when you forgive it. But really forgiving means, if you look at what the church fathers, the early church fathers, when they talk about forgiveness, and you look at how forgiveness takes place, it's to not seek revenge. It's not to continue to harbor. It doesn't mean to ever think that it was okay or I want to reassociate with. You know, it would be insane for someone who's been violated by another person to think the church says, and you have to become their best friend, right? You know, the banker ripped me off, but I have to put my money back in his control. That's not what forgiveness is. It's to not personally seek revenge, but it also doesn't mean that you stop someone from receiving the justice they're entitled to. So if someone were criminally charged, your forgiveness doesn't mean you go, oh, and I don't want them to be charged with the crime of. That's justice that they're receiving for their action, but you're not seeking personal revenge. And the importance there is you stop it from controlling you. So when we don't forgive, then that action retains control over us. And that's one of the reasons it's so important to the church and why Jesus talks about that. You know, it's that line in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our debts as we forgive, you know, our debtors. You know, so it's this necessary, but it is something you really have to sit and grapple with and get an understanding of too, because it's never a validation of an evil. You're never called to validate or accept an evil committed.
Yeah, so, you know, we were talking about antidotes too. So what would the antidote to unforgiveness be? And don't just say forgiveness. But what would help you? And kind of what Tom said too is, if you will the best for somebody, if you love someone and will the best for someone, that doesn't mean that you forget what they did to you.